Joining me now is Lisa Hymas. She is the director of the Climate and Energy Program at Media Matters for America. Lisa, welcome to the Young Turks.
Thanks for having me on. Great to be here.
No problem. So I want to dive into the candidates' positions a little bit too on this climate change issue. And we certainly want to talk about how the press is treating this. But let's start with the debates. So in 2016, we had a significant issue because climate change was almost never brought up. Has it gotten any better this time around?
Only a little bit. That's what I would say. I mean, you're right. In 2016, it was terrible. There were 20 presidential primary debates in the 2015 and 2016 time period, and only about 1.5% of the questions were about climate change. And in the debates between Hillary and Trump, there were no questions at all about climate change. So, they're starting from an abysmally low level. There's been a little bit more attention to climate change. So last week we did see some questions in the debates, but there wasn't enough time spent on them. The questions weren't good enough. Not all candidates had a chance to weigh in. So there's still a lot more improvement needed.
Well, there's two ways to look at it, right? They went from 1.5% to 6%. So, hey, they quadrupled the number of questions.
That's the generous read.
Yeah. On the other hand, 6% is not a very high number.
Right.
But you mentioned the press there and how they didn't frame the questions very well. Well, that's interesting. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, some of the questions were, is this going to just mean government telling people what to do, and how are we going to pay for this? And the whole, the frame on too many of the questions was, that fighting climate change is going to might be costly or difficult or uncomfortable, with no acknowledgement that not fighting climate change is going to be much more costly and uncomfortable and damaging. So they kind of set the frame up wrong, and in a way, just sort of it's like the Republican frame. How are you going to pay for this? Well, how are we going to? How can we afford not to pay for this? And how are the Republicans paying for their massive tax cuts? Who's asking them that? It's like the automatic go-to for Democrats. How are you going to pay for that? But it's not put in the larger context.
Yeah. Well, so then are you frustrated with some of the proponents of big action on climate change for not addressing that better? Because I got to be honest, I am, right? So the press does a terrible job of framing often. They come at it on economic issues, not social issues, but on economic issues. They come at it from a completely conservative point of view.
Yes.
But isn't it incumbent on the candidates to say, wait a minute, how are we going to pay for this current system? How are we going to pay for all those fires in California and all the floods in Houston and Puerto Rico and Florida? All that money, ExxonMobil already took the profits home. How come they're not paying for it? So is there still a little bit of reticence on the part of the Democrats to be more aggressive?
I mean, I think you've got some candidates who are talking about that and who are laying out their plans. And frankly, it's not getting a lot of press. So I think it's, a candidate can put out a great plan on their website and try talking about it in interviews, and sometimes the host will change the subject if they bring it up. We see that a lot in the media coverage that we monitor here at Media Matters. A lot of candidates in the two nights of the debate last week, they tried to bring up climate change when other questions came up, but they ended up bringing up climate change more than the moderators did. But that didn't, the moderators are still setting the terms of the discussions in many cases, whether that's in the debates or whether that's when they have, when they're interviewing candidates on the Sunday morning political shows or on other programs. Yes, we do want candidates to be out there talking about this, explaining what their plans are, but if the media doesn't cover that and engage on that, a lot of people still aren't going to hear about it.
So Lisa, I want to distinguish between the different moderators here, because it does make a difference. And in fact, I'll ask you a question about that, because Rachel Maddow did do a good job in challenging Hickenlooper and asked the question, can oil and gas companies be real partners in this fight? Because Hickenlooper talks about working with them to address climate change. So that's a good aggressive question to ask of someone who thinks oil and gas companies are not the problem, but potentially part of the answer. On the other hand, Chuck Todd kind of gave a softball to both Kamala Harris and Buttigieg, especially Buttigieg, in saying, how's your plan going to help farmers impacted by climate change in the Midwest? That's a total softball to an establishment candidate that they prefer more. So wouldn't it make sense for the Democrats to once get moderators that are all progressives? Wouldn't that be an interesting twist?
I would certainly love to see that. I mean, there are calls for a dedicated climate debate, a lot of people calling for that. And one of the hopeful or potential benefits to that would be having moderators who are well informed about the issues. Even if they're not outwardly or publicly progressive, just if they know the right questions to ask. So I think there are a bunch of good mainstream reporters you could get who are on this beat who would ask tough and informative questions. And I also think there are good climate reporters at some progressive publications like, Mother Jones or The Nation, who would also do a great job of asking those questions. But the problem is that when you sort of get the general interest, political folks, most of them aren't well informed enough to ask good questions and to call candidates out when they're sort of hedging, or to push them and get the answers that would actually tell us something new.
Let Ryan Grimm at him is what I say.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's talk about that a little bit more in terms of the different candidates, because you brought that up. So I don't know if you're allowed to comment, working for Media Matters here, on the candidates' positions. Maybe we could at least start out with the press and how they're challenging candidates, because one of my gripes is there's a lot of superficiality. And what I want to know, but that's part of why we started the Progressive Economic Pledge at the Young Turks. Where are you on these issues, right? The voters have a right to know what you actually think. And so are you in favor of the Green New Deal? What do you think that means? How would you implement it? So first, let's talk about the press side of it. How good or bad a job have they done in getting these candidates to delineate exactly where they are on this issue?
Yeah, well, at Media Matters, we're focused on the press and pushing them to do a better job rather than on the candidates. And media has done a really poor job so far. I mean, they just aren't asking good enough questions and getting the candidates. I mean, one of the things that would be useful is to help voters understand the differences between candidates' plans. Yeah, they're all going to say climate change is important. I'll get the US back into the Paris deal. But yeah, what's your plan to deal with energy extraction on public lands? What are you going to do about fossil fuel subsidies? Do you think nuclear should be or should not be part of a climate action plan? How are you going to help, communities of color and low-income communities who tend to be the most affected by climate change? How are you going to affect the people who work in the oil and gas and coal industry now, who might need to transition to new jobs? What are you going to do for those folks? How are you going to help the agriculture sector? What should we do on transportation? There are so many great specific questions, and the candidates actually disagree or have not made their views clear on a lot of these questions. And so I'd love to see moderators and just media hosts in general, when they're interviewing these candidates, really dig in a lot more.
Yeah, that's why some of the candidates avoid our show. And some of them are wonderfully honest, whether we agree or disagree. Like John Delaney will always tell you where he stands and doesn't hesitate. Same with Andrew Yang, et cetera. But good luck trying to pin down Pete Buttigieg on an answer. He talks about his values. I have no idea what his climate change plan is. I don't know if he even has one. Partly because almost no one ever asks him.
Right, no one asks, and then if they ask a vague question, and they don't ask good follow-up questions. So I mean, and that's what we saw both nights of the debate last week. There were no follow-up questions. The questions that were asked allowed candidates to get away with some pretty vague answers that didn't really tell people anything. But every candidate needs to be on the record at this point with how they stand on a range of issues related to climate change and energy.
So you're asking for a climate change debate, if I understand that right. So let me challenge that a little bit, because I think it's incredibly important, but I also think the other issues are also incredibly important. So for example, I would say on the issue of campaign finance reform, they've been even less specific overall, with a couple of exceptions. And my God, do they not get challenged on that at all? Are you for a bill?
Right.
Are you for an amendment? How do you want to get an amendment? Got almost no clarity at all there. So why is it fair to have a debate just about climate change?
Well, I think there are a lot of important issues at stake in this election, definitely. I would say there's been a big groundswell of demand from voters and activists. More than 200,000 voters have signed petitions calling for a climate debate. A number of members of the DNC, the DNC chair Tom Perez said, no, we're not going to have one, but a lot of members of the DNC are calling for one, and in fact are going to be, have, I believe, secured themselves the chance to vote next month on whether there will be one. Voters are consistently telling pollsters that climate change is, likely Democratic voters are consistently telling pollsters that climate change is one of their top issues. Basically, climate change is literally a life or death issue, not just for individuals who are in the way of extreme weather, not even just for the cities and communities that are going to be affected, that are already being affected, but for really like the entirety of human civilization.
Yeah.
I don't think that's an exaggeration if you listen to what reputable climate scientists are telling us right now. That said, I actually think I think it would be really informative to have dedicated debates on other issues too, so people could dive in on healthcare, on campaign finance reform, on immigration. I think that would be much more interesting than debates where they just kind of skip around and gloss over issues really superficially.
Yeah, so Lisa, that is a really interesting point. It would be fascinating to see it unfold like that. But I have to disagree with you. I think that if we lose this planet, it's not a big deal. We just go to the second or third planet we have, and we're fine. Life and death seems a
Jeff
bit of a.
Bezos has that figured out, right? He's got the ships that are going to carry us all there.
Yeah, at least some of us, right? All right, last thing, even though we're out of time. So do you guys track, and I don't know the answer to this, how much fossil fuel money the networks take, the television networks take in the form of advertising, and how that might be influencing them?
It's a good question. We don't track that specifically. I will say there was an ExxonMobil ad that ran during one of the debates last week, which was interesting to see. They're corporations. They are, they do pay attention to their advertisers. I think it's sometimes hard to tell how much that affects the journalists. Good journalists will say that there's a firewall, that they're not affected by that. I think for us behind the scenes, it can be hard to tell, but I'd love to see those networks not taking the fossil fuel ads.
Well, that would be a way of trusting them a little bit more.
Right.
That their profit motive is not in the way.
Exactly.
All right. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us. Everybody check out Media Matters, giving you the numbers and covering these issues of how the press is handling this campaign very thoroughly. Thank you for joining us, really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot for having me.
On the go? Don't worry, we got you covered. You can still listen to TYT at our new podcast network. Find us on Apple Podcasts, the Google Play Store, or at tyt.com/podcast.